Thank you very much. Welcome back. The next item in our agenda for this GSSB meeting is the review of the GRI waste disclosures work, and we have Sarah Jane Dominic from the Standards Division to talk us through that. Sarah Jane, you ready to do that?
I am ready to do that.
Good.
I think what would be worthwhile is Michelle Washer was the sponsor for this project, this revision of the waste disclosures, and I think it would be very good that Michelle gives us an introduction of what we've done and where we've got to.
Okay. First, I have to say that I was very impressed with the work of the Standards Division. The working group was a very diverse group. When we had the first conference call, I remember that what I heard the most during the call was, "I don't agree with you." And so I thought it was going to be very difficult. When there were the 2 days of face-to-face meeting, I missed the first day. I came on the second day, and everybody was working together and smiling, and I wondered if I was in the right room. And so in just one day, they had a very diverse group working all together for one purpose. So that was very impressive. My own position in that, I immediately introduced that I had two caps. One which was representing the Global Sustainability Standards Board, which is the easy part. It basically means supporting the Standards Division because they know very well what we expect also, but sometimes it's stronger when I say, as a member of the GSSB, yes, I can confirm that you need to pay attention to this. Second, whether I want it or not, I'm still a representative from reporting organizations, so I will have opinions linked to the facts that I'm a reporting organization. But there I made it very clear when I made a comment that this was an opinion as a reporting organization, and that as I was not a member of the group, they could discard my opinion if they wanted. So it was just an additional feedback. But as time got by, I felt less and less the need to make any comment because I thought it was moving very well. There is one disclosure, the first one, 306.1, on which I want to attract particularly your attention. This is the one where we address impacts outside the boundaries of the organization, so waste impacts throughout the value chain. It's not an easy topic. Asking organizations to report on waste generated throughout the value chain today is certainly mission impossible. On the other hand, at a time when circular economy is becoming a hot topic and all organizations are also asked to look at impacts outside of their own boundaries, and asked to make life cycle analysis and other topics like that, and asking nothing would make absolutely no sense either. I think that what we have here is a very interesting compromise, and I'll go further than that. The way it is written, it could apply to a lot of other topics. We could very well use exactly the same disclosure on water, for example. And so, yes, it's worthy of attention because at some point, I made a comment to Sarah Jane, maybe we open Pandora's box here because we have something that in fact could apply to a lot of different standards. So if it's well written, it's a serious topic.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So I'll walk you through what we did, how we did it, and the outcome, and welcome any questions that you may have. Now, I have received comments, queries directly from a number of you, and we have responded to point certain things out, but I welcome any further feedback, and if you want to raise those points, please do so. So without further ado, I will commence. Okay, so the objectives of this session, we would like to present the exposure draft of the proposed GRI 306 waste standard for approval for public comment, so that's the major objective. And we will also add some details to our approach to the public comment, promotion of the exposure draft. Obviously discuss any comments, questions you have, as I've already mentioned. Okay, so the background. When the Water and Effluent Standard was published in 2018, it borrowed some of its topic contents from what was waste and effluents. So that left us with overlap between the GRI 306 waste standard that exists now and the new water and effluents that was released in 2018. So that left us with a direct implication to review this. So we did that, being very mindful that since the contents had been reviewed, the technical contents of the waste standard, that there has been an evolution in terms of thought about what waste is and various waste management practices. So we did indeed go ahead and look at what was left in GRI 306 that wasn't related to effluents. We also took the opportunity to look into materials because one of the key concepts we've identified is this evolution in thinking that materials and waste are very much interlinked, and you can't look at waste in the absence of the materials that you procure and how you use them. They ultimately become your waste. This is just to give an indication of the members of the project working group. We endeavoured to cover all geographic regions. We endeavoured to represent all of the relevant constituencies, and we also endeavoured to cover a number of industries and range and size of organisations, particularly when it comes to business reporters. So we very much didn't want to only focus on multinationals. We wanted representatives who would come from countries that are representing SMEs. And we feel that we achieved that, and that maybe reflects Michelle's earlier comment that there was a diverse understanding of the topic when we set out, but we believe we've reached very good consensus in the various project working group meetings that we have had, and that has brought us to this point of having a draft standard that we table before you. So, what are the key recommendations in the standard? So there's two slides here. The emphasis on the connection between materials and waste. So really, the decisions you make about what you put into your process, how you use it, will ultimately impact the waste that is generated and how that then has to be managed. And we've also, Michelle has touched upon this, really widened it to the value chain, because this notion of extended producer responsibility, thinking about if you put a material out there, even if it's a product that you put out there and it's to be used, at some point in the future, that will become waste. And the decisions that you make in relation to the suppliers you use and the composition of material inputs into your manufacturing process, for instance, they all have a direct impact on waste generation. We have also introduced this concept of circularity and waste prevention to the extent that we feel it is appropriate without making this a circularity standard. There are various initiatives out there that attempt to do that, and that we feel is pushing it too far, but we do feel that we need to give an opportunity for those reporting organisations that are preventing waste and they are starting to think about circularity, take-back schemes, things like that, that we really incorporate in the standard somewhere for them to do that. We've also put an emphasis on solution providers, so those organisations that are helping prevent waste. So it may be that they don't directly generate waste themselves, but they are producing initiatives to reduce packaging waste or reuse or recycling of packaging waste. We've introduced a reporting requirement on waste streams, and this is something that we're very mindful to do. So it's all very well and good saying I have however many tons of waste, but it's very useful, I think, for a stakeholder to understand what that waste is. Is it plastics? Is it e-waste, etc.? We have aligned the waste management methods, as we call them. So if you're landfilling, you're recycling, with the waste management hierarchy that is well used and well known, particularly within the EU. So we tried to reflect that better in the standard as well. We have removed something that was in the existing waste standard, and that is the disclosure around transport of hazardous waste. The reason being that you need a whole lot of context to understand whether that is a good or a bad thing, whether it has a negative or positive impact. For example, if you're moving waste from one country to another so that it can be recycled, potentially that is better than incinerating it within the country that it was generated within. So we felt that you would have to have a whole host of disclosures to provide the context to understand that. We have taken a lot of time to revise the definitions, and this is something that there's a whole host of diverse opinions on should we borrow definitions from existing regulations, legislation from around the world, should we allow reporting organizations to define their own terms, such as what waste means. We've actually opted for, as you will have seen in the standard, opted for a more generic approach, and we would encourage reporters to give us, more definition or greater definition if that's what they're using to report their waste. And finally, we have added what we feel is a lot of guidance throughout the draft, and we encourage any comments on where you think that we can improve that. And we have given sample tables for reporting, and those are only examples that an organization can choose to use. Okay, so what have we ended up with? We have ended up with 3 disclosures. 2 of them very much speak to the management approach, and the third one consists of more quantitative indicator type data. So I will walk you through each of these disclosures. So this is the one Michel has already talked about in his introduction, and this is the process flow of inputs and outputs. So the intent of this was to reflect the thinking that a reporting organization would be encouraged to do to truly understand where the waste-related impacts occur, that they contribute to, that they cause directly across their entire value chain. So not just within what arguably sits within their legally controlled entities. And what we've asked for here is an understanding of the inputs and outputs that lead or could lead to significant waste-related impacts, including the composition of the inputs and outputs. And we use that term very loosely because we're hoping a reporting organization will define what the composition is. Do they have hazardous properties in the materials that they're putting into their manufacturing process, for instance? We've then come up with this term destination of outputs. So this is not necessarily geographical destination, but is it going to end up in landfill? Is it going to be reused by another organization as input into their manufacturing process, for instance? And then an understanding of why these inputs and outputs lead or could lead to significant waste-related impacts. So is it the nature of the materials that you're using? Or is it the sheer quantity of packaging, say, that you're producing that then causes the significant waste-related impact or contributes to? So I think I've probably covered most of those points. And then having provided a user of the report with the context that they would obtain from the process flow, we then want to understand how they are managing these impacts that they have identified. So we have a suite of reporting requirements here. The first one being, please describe what the impacts are, because without that, you can't really understand whether the management of that impact is appropriate or not from a stakeholder's perspective. Which of the identified impacts the organization is managing and why it's managing these impacts and not others. And we saw this as quite critical because the expectation is that a reporting organization will be managing the impacts that it directly causes. But there is this evolution in terms of extended producer responsibility, really, taking some level of accountability for impacts elsewhere in your value chain that you have contributed to based on decisions you have made about design of your product, the type of packaging that you put it out there, how reusable products are when they come to the end of their initial life. We've also asked, obviously, how they're addressing those impacts, and this is where we have introduced the concept of circularity. So is there anything within the thinking that speaks to circularity? And we have given an indication in the guidance, as by no means an exhaustive list, to give them some understanding of what these types of initiatives may be. And we hope by doing that they would then go and seek the relevant information that is out there, that is constantly being added to in terms of what circularity initiatives are. We have then reiterated very specifically, and we acknowledge that this is part of the management approach in GRI 103, that we want to understand how the organization sets goals and targets. So is it merely setting goals and targets that it is required to under local regulation or legislation, or is it voluntarily going further to really think about the impacts within the value chain? And then finally, we would want to understand the processes that are in place to collect and monitor waste-related data. So if it has understood that there is an impact it is contributing to within its supply chain, how is it going about understanding that impact, and what data is it using to understand whether it is able to manage that impact in some way? So those two are the management approach related ones, and then it brings us to the disclosure about waste actually managed. So this is very much a quantitative disclosure, and we spent a lot of time honing in on what we feel is important here. So the total waste of waste managed, broken down by waste stream that I talked about earlier. So do you give a user of the report an understanding of what it is you're actually managing with respect to waste? And it's worth pointing out that this is the reporting organization's waste that it generates in its own activities. Okay, so we are not at this stage asking for quantitative measures elsewhere in the value chain. Some organizations are already there with buyback schemes. They know how much they get back of their product, but we are not requiring that at this stage because we feel that many reporting organizations would not be able to achieve that, and it would be very aspirational. So we also ask for an understanding of hazardous and non-hazardous waste, and a breakdown of how this waste is managed by the different methods that I've already referred to, so reuse, recycling, recovery, incineration, and landfill. And then finally, we are asking more about how they understand that their waste is managed, because we all know a lot of reporting organizations engage a third party to manage their waste on their behalf. And how formal is that, and what information do they have to understand that when they have given some waste to be recycled, that it actually is recycled? So we feel that there's transparency to be improved here between, well, I've done my part as a reporting organization, but how have you, understood that that has been followed through and acted upon? And we have asked for an indication of waste managed on-site and off-site, and for some industries this is quite important, such as mining, because a lot of the waste is managed on-site, and I think that would be useful for stakeholders to understand where the waste is actually being managed. Okay. And then we have sort of talked about the processes in place. And then the final one is any contextual information to understand. So there will be estimates, assumptions used in coming up with the quantitative data, and it would be very useful to understand on what basis that data has been gathered. We do have a reporting recommendation, and this is something that we felt was aspirational, but some organizations might be further along in their thinking, understanding, reporting on this, and that's the total waste of waste prevented as a result of circularity measures. So an example of this might be having returns of your products that you can put back into your manufacturing process. We would say that that is prevention of waste, and it's a circularity initiative. I will pause there. Because I've cantered through very quickly the technical content, and I would welcome any comments, queries.
Okay, Corley and then Kirsten.
Sarah Jane, thank you very much for that overview. Just a question, and please forgive me if I'm missing it somewhere, but in Disclosure 3062, you talk about how the organization sets goals and targets. Is there any requirement that they disclose the actual goals and targets, or how is that intended to be dealt with?
Yes. So the Management Approach Standard, GRI 103, actually asks for an understanding of goals and targets, but we wanted to give some more contextual information around it, which is why we have specifically brought it into here. But arguably, you could say it overlaps quite closely with what they are expected to have addressed in terms of their management approach documentation.
When I go through a new draft standard, I try to have at least 3 sets of eyes. First of all, it's would this work for my organization, which is a large organization and highly experienced in. And the third, how would this work for a small or medium-sized organization that is new to reporting and has limited resources? In this case, I would say that this one seems to cover all the needs in a very good way. When I started reading through the first disclosures, it was a bit complex and complicated. It always is, actually. But while I was thinking through it, while reading, I found out, well, yes, this makes sense. And if you read through it a couple of times, most kind of people would understand what was standing there. And I was starting thinking, how would I respond to this for my organization? And I was seeing in my inner eye and some kind of a process flowchart. And then I saw that there should be an appendix with examples, and I went there and found out that, well, yes, this was very simple, very similar to what I had visualized already. And I also agree to what Michelle said, that this is a format that could be used also for other kind of reporting topics. All in all, I'm really impressed about the draft. And my only comment, I've already said to Sarah Jane, is that I think that the concept of due diligence is a bit unclear. It's unclear to me what is really meant here in the context, and for sure it would be really confusing for somebody that was new to reporting. One more thing that I have forgotten to say, to mention earlier, I'm a bit confused about the underlined words in or concepts throughout the standard. I didn't find out why they were underlined. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think your last comment is probably the easier one to address. They actually relate to hyperlinks, so there should be a definition particularly when we first introduced the term in the standards. So circularity, you click onto that and that will take you to the glossary.
Not all of them were included in the glossary because I thought about it might be concepts that were explained in the glossary, but not all were.
Okay, I will definitely go back and double check, but that was the intent.
Yeah, so that's an action for us. Then this is a formatting issue, but the intent was to have them cross-linked.
Very good intent.
Okay, and thank you for your general comments and that you found the examples aligned with your thinking. That pleases us greatly. To address the comment about due diligence, and I know that a definition exists within the standard, but I completely take on board that not everybody, in terms of who would like to encourage to use this standard as reporting organizations, has necessarily the same understanding when they see those two words as we might, based on the work that we do and its use elsewhere, such as human rights, which I know we will come on to speak at great length later. So I think that one is a very valuable comment, and what we could do is expand and give more context to what we mean specifically in relation to this topic. What do we mean by a due diligence exercise and what that could look like?
Other comments, discussion? Michel.
Yes, I could make a very small comment. I go through exactly the same thinking than you. And for me, the key words were first significant, which is left to the appreciation of the organization, and the method you use to identify it. So I thought small and medium enterprise or a small enterprise, if they have identified just one impact outside of their boundaries, they can already report on that and use the standards and be in it. So for me, it was also pretty universal. But yes, there were a lot of discussions about the right words to be used, waste generated or waste managed. And well, as I'm saying, I think we got something which is certainly ready enough to go for public comments.
Thank you. I appreciate and admire the effort that's gone into this this proposal, and I think it does do the job which the GRI sets out to do in terms of prompting organisations to think more about how they do things, why they do things, and how it can be more sustainable. And I thought of a classic example from my own area, which is there's been a recent report about mine and power station rehabilitation and waste management in Australia, and one of the figures which came out was that fly ash, which is a significant waste stream from power stations, that in Europe, by and large, 2/3, 3/4 of that waste is reused as construction materials, whereas in Australia less than 20% is. And there's no good explanation given for that wide variance, given that they're all modern businesses. And I suspect, I didn't see any reason given, I suspect it's simply because land is more precious in Europe, and in Australia there is more space to dump waste. But it's not a good reason. And this draft proposal will encourage power station operators worldwide to think about how they're better managing their waste stream, and that's what we should be seeking to do. So for that reason I commend the proposal.
Thank you very much, Peter. Any other discussion? Yes, please.
Hi. I almost agree with Kirsten in about to put an annex with could be examples, or could be like a scoreboard, like in another standards like human resources, about to fulfill the issues of 3063. That could be something helpful to fulfill. And regarding the comment that I sent to you about the percentage, I don't know. I was trying to expose that regarding that scoreboard, you can make the percentage against the same numbers that you have in that scoreboard. So that's just an idea, but it's about what are you disclosing, what are you putting in disclosure, that the percentage is over the same numbers that you have there.
Thank you, Gustavo. Sarah Jane, do you want to respond at all? And for that matter, I know that there's several comments that have been received from GSSB members. I don't know if you want to address those or feel that you have at this point, but I'll give you the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Judy. So Gustavo had suggested that we incorporate percentages to the metrics that we already have within 3063. And the reason for not including them was because we felt that users that wanted to calculate those percentages had the absolute numbers to do so. So whether they wanted to look at the percentage that was recycled of the total waste, the numbers are presented such that they can. And I welcome any other comments on whether you think it would be valuable. Obviously, percentages in and of themselves aren't valuable unless you understand the numerator and denominator, which we felt were more important, and they may be useful within sectors or sizes of organizations, geographical locations of organizations, depending on what waste management methods are available to them.
Yes. Well, one short comment on that is that organizations are still free to define their targets as they wish. So they may use percentage to define their targets, but somewhere in the report, the absolute value should be there.
Okay, I think maybe unless anyone else has other things they want to raise here, do you want to go on to what happens next?
Sure, I'm just quickly going through.
I see.
Any of the other comments.
Fine. Okay. Yeah.
So there was a comment from Kent that asked about could we put more in about material classification? And it's certainly something we debated at length. There are classifications out there that go down to chemical composition. They are very complex. So it's not something that we wanted to necessarily require. Obviously, an organization is, welcome to classify their materials in that way. We had in our examples suggested, or in the guidance, raw materials, recycled input. And again, we have left that to be defined by the reporting organization, depending on what the common usage is within that sector or industry. I'm looking at some of the other comments. I know, Robin, you had asked about harmonizing with other reporting protocols or initiatives that are very specific to the types of waste produced. And the one you had suggested that we know is being adopted and committed to is the food loss and waste protocol. There were specific reasons why we didn't necessarily focus on any type of waste stream initiative, and that was where do we stop almost. And new ones are always being tabled, and so for this to be future-proofed for several years, if we were to do that, are we suggesting that those are the only ones that they look to? We would hope that the standard can be used with existing or new reporting protocols, be it e-waste, food waste, lots of circularity initiatives. So we feel that the information that we've asked for closely aligns with some of the other reporting protocols, and we definitely did discuss participation of a developer from the food loss and waste protocol, but felt that their expertise was very specific when we went for a wider representation in amongst the project working group members. They have agreed to peer review the draft during public comment, and we will certainly, come on to that now, we'll certainly push this with existing initiatives to see if they feel that it is promoting reporting in alignment with those types of protocols as well.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay.
All right, thank you, everybody. So we will now outline our approach to public comment. So in terms of promotion and the types of activities that we are proposing, we would do a combination of field tests with reporters, and this is very much focused on how feasible this standard is to apply and report against for a whole range of reporters, be it small, large, different industries and sectors. And we already have a list of agreed reporters, but we would welcome any suggestions that you may have for specific types of businesses that you think may find this more challenging. We would very much welcome that input. We will have consultations with individual experts and expert groups. And I've already mentioned the food loss and waste reporting protocol, and we have a list of others that we will seek input from. But again, if you have specific contacts, do share them with us. Obviously, the actual standard we will release in the usual way on our online platform, and we will do a host of promotion activities to engage groups in specific regions or sectors using our GRI regional network. Okay. Any comments, questions? So in terms of timing, I didn't mention that, but that is on the slide. We look to put this out there some point during the month of May. That is our aim. Okay. So I think I will have covered those, and just some more examples there. You can see point 4, we will talk to other bodies, standard setters, to see that this aligns with their understanding as well.
Sarah Jane, can I ask about the field test? What does that look like? How are you looking to put that together?
So we have already identified, we've been at various conferences, we were at the World Resources Forum, and part of that was outreach to identify users of the standard. And so we have already a list of individual organizations that we would like to try and do a mock-up. So we would actually like them to take the standard and think about how they would report against the various disclosures for their organization. So we have consumer electronics, we have chemicals, beverages, IT type companies, we have waste management organizations, because we hope that this standard can be used by those who are actually receiving waste from others, and they're doing the recycling and the landfilling, etc. And we would look to understand that this works for them as well.
Is there a specific sort of a format for that, and a kind of a process document for them to all work through, so that they're all sort of evaluating the same things, or is it more a question of see where you get to with it and let us know?
Yep, so we would look to do it in a consistent manner, such that we will present them, leave them with the standard to look at and report back to us in a structured way. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah Jane. I mean, I think what we have to do at this point is actually, because our colleague Tony Moe is on a delayed flight and he will be joining us after lunch, we need to park the final, the decision on the, of the GSSB to agree this draft to be released for public comment, yeah, until he's here after lunch. So I think we can probably move on to the next thing at this point, unless there's anything that we haven't done yet with respect to this topic. We'll just have to come back to it in a little while after lunch. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. I very much appreciate that, and thank you also to Michel for your efforts on behalf of the GSSB with this project. Okay, and will you be available after lunch, should it be required?
I will be available. I'm staying for the rest of the day because I'll be doing the presentation on Universal later.
Brilliant.
So maybe it makes sense to do that at the beginning of that session.
Yeah.
And we'll do the approval then.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right, so that means then that we're on to the sector program update. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm ready,
So
Judy.
Madare Oliver from the Standards Division is here to talk to us about all of that. Shall I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Judy, and it's nice to see all of you here today. So as Bastian mentioned, we do have a fair number of things to talk about within the sector program. Even though it's a new team, we've been hard at work with many proposals. So first, I would like to go over just an overview of what proposals have come before you. If you've been here with the GSSB since November, you will have seen 4 sector proposals by now. Then I'd like to speak about the contributions of the GSSB subcommittee, which is Evan and Kirsten and Vincent. Then I'd like to focus our attention on the oil, gas, and coal sector standard proposal, which is coming up for approval today. It was presented previously in February. After that, I would like to open up for discussion the terms of reference, item 6, for the GSSB project working group for the oil, gas, and coal sector standard. After this, I would like to briefly discuss the Stakeholder Council response on the other projects, which we are not bringing for approval today, and then finally talk about next steps for the sector program. So as part of an overview, oil, gas, and coal will come before you today. So this is the front runner for the sector program. It was proposed at the 7th of February meeting. We have made certain adjustments to the timeline, but they're not significant ones. So, for example, the in-person meeting was originally projected for August, but on further consideration, it didn't seem advisable to try to bring together a group in person during the holiday period. So we have adjusted that to mid-September in 2019. In addition, that pushes back very slightly our anticipated time for the exposure draft to mid-December 2019. But at present, we are still anticipating, as we originally did, that the sector standard can be released in June of 2020. Some activities that the team has been working on related to the oil, gas, and coal sector standard. We have a project manager. She has mapped issues that have been identified by international organizations, by standard setters, and by other research work. We have begun to draft descriptions for the first environmental issues, and there is a lot of learning that is occurring in this process, where we see what is working, what isn't working, what's a reasonable length, what is too much, and so on. We have begun to connect externally with organizations of interest. We have connected with the OECD and are having ongoing conversations with them about these projects. They are keen to work with us on the sector program. We have had conversations with UN Environment and also with IPECA, the industry organization for the oil and gas sector, with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and also from a good number of research providers, Sustainalytics, MSCI, ISS, Figeo, IRIS, and a few more on the way, who are sharing their analyst contacts with us so that if we have questions or need to discuss, we can draw on their expertise. The team has also begun to pinpoint relevant organizations who should be informed of the open call for nominations. And then finally, our project manager attended the International Petroleum Week in January to engage with participants in the sector and to get to know the sector better. Next, I would like to talk about the agriculture proposal. So this came before you on the 7th of February. We have since recognized, and our subcommittee also advised us, that this project needs to lag the oil and gas project. With a team of 4, it's too difficult to run these projects in parallel and do 2 in-person meetings and so on. So therefore, the timeline has been adjusted to ensure the smooth delivery of the oil, gas, and coal sector project. The in-person meeting is now projected for mid-January of 2020. So that allows us to separate bringing forward an exposure draft for oil, gas, and coal, and then after that draft it goes to public comment to then run the in-person meeting for agriculture. This would mean that we would expect delivery of an exposure draft for agriculture in April 2020, and we would expect a release of the sector standard for agriculture in November of 2020. Also, we have been considerably busy on activities related to the agriculture project. The project manager has mapped issues identified by international organizations and other research organizations. We have begun to draft descriptions for the first social issues on agriculture, which is also providing significant learning. We have connected with the OECD and with analysts from research providers, as well as some civil society organizations, and we can see that there is huge appetite for developing this standard. And our project manager is going to be attending an OECD agriculture event in April, and then also the Future of Food conference in June. Now, 2 other sector proposals that have come before you in the past. I just wanted to go over these as well, and what is the status. Mining was proposed on November 29th of 2018. At the time, we learned that the ICMM would not be able to participate during the timeline that we projected. Therefore, this project waits until 2020, but we intend to bring it forward again at that time. And then last, textiles and apparel, which was also proposed on the 7th of February. So textiles and apparel was brought forward because we realized after the experience with mining and ICMM that we needed to bring proposals proactively so that we could be ready to bring something for approval very quickly if a hiccup arose in scheduling. And textiles and apparel is essentially a next in line proposal. So it has been circulated to the GRI board and stakeholder council for feedback. Feedback has been received, and this proposal can be brought forward when there is capacity to run this project. This might be a good moment to take feedback or questions or comments if you have comments on these changes.
Yeah, good call. Kent, I see you reaching for your...
Yeah, I was just, we have existing sector guidelines that have existed, in the past, and I assume reporters still refer to those. But these new sector, we call these standards now, and is there something I need to know about the relationship of these to the rest of the standards? That is, in terms of authority, do these carry the same level of authority as the rest of the standards? I guess I'd like to understand that a little better.
Sure. So you're right that sector standard implies that it's an authoritative pronouncement and that these will follow the due process protocol, which was not the case in the past with the past sector contents. So they do have a certain gravitas as account of that, and they may confer a requirement on corporate reporters, even if that requirement is something as simple as to say, if you are in this sector, you must read and consider the issues within this sector standard. So they are part of the GRI standards. They are not considered to be something ancillary or guidance material. Bastian, you may wish to speak to this further.
The one thing that I would add, we have to look at the contents that we're creating and what of it will become a requirement. But I think to your question on what happens with the contents that are in existence, I think for every project that we start where we have a corresponding sector guidance in existence, the work that we do here would then automatically lead to the situation that it supersedes the existing contents. But we have, and that is, I think, reporting based on the GRI standards is in part at least driven by the existing sector guidances as well. We have strong uptake in some of the industries where we have issued in the past sector guidance. So as long as we don't have contents that supersede them, we should leave them in existence because it is an important orientation for the reporters. But it also creates a bit of a, I think, urgency, because right now we're referring to contents that basically existed under G4, and some date back more than 10 years. At least the start of the creation of them. So that's the urgency behind the sector program more general, that we have to offer something in place of these contents through the sector program that we're starting now.
Gustavo, and then Kirsten, and then Evan.
Yeah, it's just a small question. I understand that we are working with the GSSB industry classification. No. Oh, okay. Well, never mind. And we are going in this sector program. We are going to cover in a long term all industries. All industries are going to be merged. Some of them industries. I don't know how we are going to work.
Yes. So earlier I guess at the November 29th meeting, we brought forward as part of the sector program description a bit of a discussion on external classification systems and whether these would be seen as helpful for the work that we were going to do. We did decide at that time, having looked at GICS and ICB and also ISIC, that none of these classifications was entirely suited. We also looked at the GSSB classification system, and I think, again, it was not entirely fit for purpose. So a decision was made that we would consider the right boundary of a sector and refer to external classifications using a sector key with each project. So for example, for the first project, you're seeing that it includes oil, gas, and coal. And you will see that within that proposal, there is a sector key that refers to GICS, ICB, and ISIC to help stakeholders understand what is included in this, what is not included. But I also want to emphasize that we can see already at this stage of the program that there are a lot of nuances and that stakeholders see very differently where certain things belong. So there's really no possibility to get a perfect boundary to a sector that meets everyone's approval and that serves everyone's needs. So I think we can see in the program that it's mostly a case of being transparent and providing clear references on what is in and what is out, rather than being able to attain a sort of state of perfection on what is included and having that meet everyone's demands. Stakeholders just have very different feelings about where things go and where to draw the boundary of a sector.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Just to follow up on some of what Bastian was saying, I can confirm that the G4 sector supplements are still alive, at least some of them. The International Council on Mining and Metals, it is still a requirement for their members to report according to GRI, including the G4 mining and metals sector supplement. So we included in our GRI standards report, where they fit most in. It would clearly be something we would have missed if they were taken completely away. And there's lots of content in it that we need to continue through the new sector supplements.
Evan.
Well, my question goes exactly to that point. What evidence, I mean, that was actually pretty interesting. What evidence do we have about the continuing traction of those old supplements? I mean, we have download numbers on the standards themselves. We have anecdotal evidence about how it's used in particular industries with some emphasis. But do we have any idea how popular and embedded those old sector supplements are across the board? It's something that comes up in the subcommittee sometimes. How deferential should we be to the existing precedent there?
So we have statistics regarding the uptake of the different sector supplements, and I think broadly speaking, you can say those sectors that have a sector supplement in existence have a higher uptake compared to other sectors. What I would always look at the statistics that we have in-house with a pinch of salt, because we know they're not complete, and we know that we actually, for some regions, are far behind registering all GRI reports. What we could do, we don't have it handy right now, but I think we could reproduce some of the stats around for your benefit, also when we move to prioritizing future sector projects. We did consider this also in looking at the first set of projects that we are proposing. So mining, for the followership that it has, and also the mandate that the ICMM has over its members to require it. Oil and gas, financials, I think these are the three most popular ones, probably. But when they are, correct me if I'm wrong there, we can definitely reproduce these contents and look at statistics, right?
I know that the standards has received information from, I mean, we have requests to download and requests to find certain materials. I don't know that we have what I would consider to be a complete data set, but I could certainly look into that and see what can be provided.
Okay, I've got Robin and Peter, and anyone else? No.
Yeah, I just had a question about the oil, gas and coal grouping, because I think when we first saw this, it was just oil and gas. So the inclusion of coal, it might be worth sort of talking about the rationale for that. I think I know what the answer is going to be, but there's also the notion that there are very different reporters perhaps within that group when you introduce coal to that grouping.
I'll just insert myself. For what it's worth, I had a similar thought, also because we're looking at doing mining next year, and there must be some kind of interplay between these things where it comes to coal specifically.
Yes. So, and I could tell you sort of the preliminary findings that we've had as we go to write up issues and have oil and gas and coal and how is that working. We can see that within a sector standard, there could be certain breakdowns that occur within a sector. So for example, in agriculture, if agriculture has animal protein production and it also has crop production, you might have a divergence on certain issues for how to explain them, how to explain how these things are materializing or what the issues mean. I think we will definitely see a similar breakdown in issue descriptions between oil and gas and coal. And I also would not rule out that two standards might be applicable to coal. That oil, gas, and coal might be one of those, especially from a fossil fuel production angle, and that mining might also be applicable. So these are things that as we get a little bit further along in the research, we can see more clearly how this might work. And if you think of business organizations that are further downstream, they might pick up several different sector areas of relevance. So for food retail, perhaps it might be that an agriculture sector standard would be relevant, and then possibly a food processing might be relevant, and then also distribution, also retail. So this becomes clearer as we get further involved in these contents. I think it's very much to be emphasized at this point that we are at the pilot stage. We are at the startup phase. And as we begin this first project, we expect to uncover many more learnings on how to do this and how to do this well. I will say there are a lot of different business models out there. I do not see that in the future that we will be able to do 150 different sector projects to hit, a sub-industry level. So we do consider feasibility as well when we set up these sector standards to try to hit where the impacts are, what are similar impacts, but then further nuances are still to be discovered.
Okay, Peter.
Thank you. Yes, I'm raising an issue again, which Robin has raised about the boundary of this sector description. Oil and gas and coal being put in together is a novel grouping. I think we should say that. And when I look at the rationale that's given for the prioritisation, I look at the economic impacts, the social impacts, and so on. I actually see it as similar. Oil and gas and coal is not being distinguished from the rest of mining, from the rest of resource extraction industries. It is in the environmental impacts in emissions and climate change, which I think is the distinguishing characteristic of oil, gas and coal being put in together, and perhaps we should be a bit more upfront about that, about the fact that this is the defining characteristic which puts oil, gas and coal separate from the rest of mining. Coal is normally put in with mining. That's the way the International Council on Mines and Metals operates, and why the oil and gas industry has a separate peak body. It tends to be separate companies. The technologies are really quite different. A question would be, if the ICMM said they're not available or ready to deal with mining yet, what have they said about coal being included with oil and gas? Because that's a significant part of the ICMM's membership and activities. And the other question would be simply to do with one of the references given in the proposal was sector-relevant reporting initiatives. It lists IPECA, or the Oil Industry Peak Body, IPECA, as having oil, gas and coal industry guidance. That's an error. They do have a sustainability reporting framework, but it doesn't include coal. So the oil and gas industry itself has not yet moved to thinking of coal as a fellow traveller or part of their industry. So, yeah, a question there, should we be more upfront about the fact that it's emissions and climate impacts, which is the driving rationale that's distinguishing it from the rest of mining? And technical question is, if the ICMM is unavailable for mining, are they really available to deal with the coal aspects of this project?
Well, the ICMM is a good point that you raise. I had not heard from them on this oil and gas and coal project. I will mention that the first time this proposal was introduced, coal was in the sector key, so that piece has not changed. But I can see now from the discussion that we're having that this needs to be brought forward more, or the constituents of the key discussed perhaps in more depth to make it clearer what is in there. It may not be enough just to distribute it and read it. Again, I don't think there's a perfect fit. It could be that coal appears twice, both within the mining sector standard and also within the oil and gas and coal sector standard. It could be that some clarification is needed within the proposal. If there are, I'm trying to discern whether there's a course of action that we are recommending, that the GSSB is recommending that we should take.
I'm not perceiving a specific one at the moment, but merely the recognition that there may be some issues around here. And if I could offer just a view that this might be resolved through here in this pilot phase, it could be very worthwhile working on the framing communications around the entirety of the project. Just this fact that there can be, when we're talking about sector standards, the very terminology could actually be a little bit distracting or a little misleading for some companies where their issues will actually overlap more than one sector in the way that we've discussed it here. So there could very well be some work to be done around some of that early positioning around what the purpose of these might be. I believe I think I'm getting the right order. I've got Gustavo, Evan, and Kirsten have raised their names again. Would you like to carry on, please?
Okay, thanks. Adding to the mess of the boundary definition of the sector, I see in the sector description that we talk a lot about energy companies. So I think that most oil and gas companies start moving to energy company to think like in that way. So I think that could be a interesting definition to the terms of the sector to add the concept of energy production.
We had considered that within the division. However, we were worried that it might lead to confusion, confusing electric utilities, and all of that implies in terms of issues and impacts if we use the term energy for this particular sector standard.
Just to bring some context, maybe some pessimism, get used to this, because even in the first 4, we have found out that these boundaries are going to be unsatisfactory, at least some of the time, to some of the people. It's exactly the problem that SASB was trying to solve with their classification system, and everybody has found problems with that system as well, too. So as we push these sectors out and as we try to figure out where the boundaries are, we're going to have to make choices. In the GSSB, in the subcommittee, through the help of the Stakeholder Council, they push back on including coal or tile or not in their feedback. So I have a feeling that no one will be perfectly happy with some of the boundaries that we have to set, but if we're going to go forward on a timely basis, we do need to establish some boundaries.
Just a clarification related to ICMM and coal. ICMM is occupied about metals mining, and while certain of their members are also involved in coal, it's not a topic related to ICMM. But of course, there will be overlap between certain sector standards, as there will be overlap for certain companies that might relate to more than one sector standard. For example, my company, we relate to the mining and metals sector supplement today and to the electric utilities sector supplement. And I suppose such double relationships will continue also in the future.
Robin.
I think maybe, as you said, there may be organisations, especially related to coal, that might end up with three or even more sector standards applying to them if they're sort of in energy and generation and retail even, as well as the digging up aspect of it. Maybe this is something that can be dealt with, the oil, gas versus coal distinctions within the different peak industry bodies and the types of reporters we're expecting to see using this particular standard. Maybe that's something that can be managed in some way by who we seek out to be on the working group. That's quite sort of structured in a way that sort of deals with some of these potential boundary issues that we're talking about.
Yes, I agree. That's a good thought, Robin, and we're certainly considering it. And I think that brings us to an important point as well, that at this stage, at the early stage with the projects, what is important is that we get clear enough the constituents of a project that we can recruit correctly. There will be a whole lot of work done afterwards to understand the nuances and how to describe things for the users that will happen in draft development. Okay, Judy, are there more questions on this?
I'm not seeing any. No, thank you.
Okay, then I'll take us back to our agenda. We've gone a little bit off track, but I think it was an important discussion for oil and gas. So my clicker is not behaving for me. I think I might have lost battery. So are you able to? Okay. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work of the GSSB subcommittee and to give them an opportunity to share, I mean, Kirsten and Evan just spoke, but to share a little bit more about what they've seen from the sector program. So the GSSB subcommittee meets regularly with us. We have used them very heavily as a focus group, introducing all kinds of materials and experiments and trying to figure out very early what works or doesn't work or is clear or isn't clear so that these can help us direct our research efforts. At the most recent meeting that we had, we shared sample materials, including a sector description for oil, gas, and coal, including a sample table linking identified issues for the sector to the GRI standards, as this is a piece that we can see will be very important to reporters. We also shared a sample table linking identified issues for the sector to SDG goals and targets. And finally, we shared some sample issue descriptions as well as references. And references are something that we've spent a surprising amount of time on, trying to figure out the nuances of how we do this. There's potential for references to balloon out to 200, 300 references in a sector standard if we aren't careful, I would say. In addition, the subcommittee has clarified their role, that they really would like to be involved in reviewing research inputs for the project working groups and exposure drafts and drafts revisions as these are produced. So now I would like to ask Evan and Kirsten, I'm sorry Vincent isn't here with us today, just to say a few remarks on the discussions that we've had.
Well, I mean, for my part, I feel like my role is reading for clarity, reading for readability, reading for understanding. I'm not an expert in any of these disciplines so far, so I try to read with Kirsten's 3 sets of eyes. How would this work for a company like mine? How would it work for an investor who's looking for information in companies like this? And how would it work for, especially for small and medium enterprises that may not have the resources to instantly produce this kind of disclosure? So without even knowing it, I was looking at it that way, but mostly looking at boundary descriptions and trying to figure out where we draw the line. I mean, you've heard a little bit of this in the discussion we've had just prior, which is where's the most germane topic for the sector established, and how do we get to the root of those issues and not necessarily bleed over into other things? And I think that we've done a good job so far of focusing, and that's why we've requested more involvement with the inputs into the committee and other things too, so that we can try to clarify things as they come up rather than deal with a chunk of text as presented at the end. So I've treated that as my role, just as a layman coming in trying to understand what can be a fairly complex or technical guidance. And I think so far, we've managed to understand the issues in play and hopefully make them a little bit more clear in the final version or in the draft version.
And from my perspective, well, I can just support what Evan said. In addition, I would say that for me it's important that we carry with us the good things from the sector supplements and that we renew them in the standards context. So we shouldn't lose anything that seems to be useful in the sector supplements, but maybe make them a bit more dynamic than the current G4 sector supplements are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Going back to the oil, gas, and coal sector standard, so just another history of this document. It was presented for the first time on the 7th of February at the GSSB meeting. It was circulated to the GRI board and stakeholder council for feedback. We received feedback from individual members of the GRI board. There was nothing that implied significant changes to this proposal. The feedback was generally supportive of the proposals and of the sectors that we are choosing to lead with. The Stakeholder Council provided feedback, which we will discuss in a moment, and today we are introducing this proposal for GSSB approval. So just the parts within the proposal, we didn't spend so much time on this at the last meeting. I think it's worth just looking at it. The rationale for prioritization, as Peter has already commented on this a bit, the oil, gas, and coal sector has been prioritized on the basis of its economic, environmental, and social impacts. And the proposal has a listing of these impacts as a first indication, though of course the project working group will overlay their expertise. In terms of objectives and scope, the objective is to identify and describe the sector's significant impacts from a sustainable development perspective. And also, this clarifies the responsibility that the project working group will be involved, that it will make recommendations based on expertise on the contents being developed in the draft, but that the standards division will write the text and do the stylistic editing and so on for the exposure draft. Then the proposal outlines the process and the timeline for this sector project. And as stated previously, there were a few changes, not significant ones, to the timeline from the previous proposal. So here is the timeline. I know there's a lot of tiny text and it's rather fuzzy on the big screen, but it shows that if this proposal is accepted at today's meeting, we will move to an open call for nominations for the project working group next week, and that we hope to have the approval of the project working group membership in June, at the June 27th GSSB meeting, and then begin developing contents afterwards. So over the August holiday, there are some reading materials that the group could be involved in reviewing, and then the in-person would happen in mid-September, with the hope that an exposure draft is ready in December of 2019, excuse me. Yeah, not moving that slowly. All right, I'd like to focus on changes to the proposal in lieu of the feedback that was received from the Stakeholder Council and also internally within the division. The overall Stakeholder Council feedback is that the proposals are self-explanatory and easy to understand. There were a couple of minor changes suggested for format and presentation. The name change was suggested to make it clearer to stakeholders, and then clearly this was needed, from oil and gas to oil, gas, and coal. And the Standards Division agrees that this change is a worthy one if it helps stakeholders understand which types of companies we're speaking about. Additionally, from the Stakeholder Council, a comment was made that the sector standard might be more focused on exploration and production activities and less focused on some of the ancillary activities within the sector, such as transport or equipment and services. The Standards Division is taking this under advisement. This is part of what we described earlier, that the project working group will be more involved in uncovering these nuances and uncovering questions of relevancy. We don't necessarily believe that every issue will be equally relevant to all of the types of businesses within the sector standard, but we can make this clearer as we develop drafts. Now, we've already had quite some discussion on this proposal, but this is a time, if you have further remarks or questions on this proposal, this is the time to do it.
Thank you, Madeir. Any further thoughts? As she says, we've already gone through a bit of detail on this today. I'm not hearing any.
Okay, does the GSSB approve item 5, the project proposal for an oil, gas, and coal?
Let me just stop you there, because we need to wait for Tony Moe to join us after lunch to to affect these approvals. But I think unless there's some further discussion that we need to get out into the open before we do that, I feel like we have probably gone as far as we can with this. Yeah.
All right, we'll take it. I'll skip over the next couple of slides in this case.
Thank you.
Let's go to the terms of reference, which is up for discussion today, not for approval per se. This is the first terms of reference for the sector program, so the Standards Division invites your comments and feedback. The terms of reference describes the project working group mandate and scope of work. So this mandate is a little bit different from other standards development. It's not focused on disclosures. It's focused on issues and descriptions. But we do think that there is likely to be some input from the project working group on disclosure gaps or disclosures that are sector specific that the project working group feels are valuable. In addition, there's a section on the project working group composition, and I would like to discuss a couple of points related to that in more depth with you in a moment. The composition is the same constituencies for all GRI standards development, business enterprises, investment institutions, mediating institutions, labor, and now I'm stuck on the fifth. Sorry? Civil society, of course. Thank you. In addition, the terms of reference outline selection criteria for the project working group, the main one being knowledge and expertise of a broad range of issues within the sector. And then finally, the terms of reference addresses the project working group commitment, including time commitments for the oil, gas, and coal sector project. On constituencies, the Standards Division is hoping to get your feedback on what you consider to be optimal percentages across the group. For example, what proportion of business enterprises do you feel should be involved in this sector project?
I think it's worth stating that this is now kind of the deep, dark mists of time, but when this was done for the G4 sector supplements, my recollection is that there was a higher percentage of business participation than typically in GRI working groups at the time for doing that. Although off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what the general percentage tended to be. But there was a very clear recognition that the practitioners' views were particularly important here when we were doing the sector-specific content. Kirsten.
Yeah, I agree that it's very important here to have a certain proportion of business represented in the working group. Preferably people with that are close to the topics that should be discussed. And I must say that I also think that some of the success of the waste working group might be partly due to the fact that business enterprise is rather heavily included in that working group. And it's something about the uptake of the sector standards.
Well, just on the history, so I think for some of the sector projects in the past, it was up to almost 50% of the membership was business. We have since then, also under the NUDO process, added a whole grouping around investment institutions, so we also have to render that in. But that there's probably a case to be made for a strong representation of the report preparers. We are definitely of the opinion, also in the standards division. Well, it is a bit the extent to which we want to reflect that in the recruitment effort now. I think, Madeira, it's fair to say that when we look at it, probably half of the group is too much, because then you probably weaken the other constituencies also in terms of representation, but going up to maybe 40% roundabout, that's probably more realistic, actually. And that would be falling in place with what you've seen with the waste group, probably add one or two additional well, it's probably one. We have 5, I think, business on waste, on the waste groups. Yeah. Yeah. Any more input from you, Madhir?
Can I just back up and ask a slightly higher level question here, Madhir? Are we talking, with respect to this issue around the representation, the optimal representation in the project working group, are we specifically talking about oil, gas, and coal, or are we? Is this now going to sort of set something that will be relevant for future sector standard projects as well? And therefore, you know, do we regard these as on a case-by-case basis, or do we regard this now as a process, a way to orientate the process going forward that we need to sort of be mindful of out with the context of this particular sector?
I think in the case of oil, gas, and coal, that worrying about downstream, and perhaps you're thinking of petrochemicals or even further out, end users of plastics and so on. I think in this particular sector, there's less of a need to think about including downstream companies and having them come back to join this group to speak about impact. So I think in the case of this sector, that oil, gas, and coal companies would suffice, and that given the differences in business model for some of these things, that 40% from oil, gas, and coal would probably be the strongest way to move forward on these contents.
I think possibly my question is a little bit more generic than that, which is to say, if we then turn to financial services or food processing, and we say it's 40% on this one, are we then sort of taking that as the template for future sector standard working groups to say that, you know, regardless of what the sector is, would that be the sort of starting point that we would say that would tend to be the way to construct these?
I would be a little bit leery of setting it as something that we want to do across all 40 until we've tried it once or twice in the pilot projects. So I would rather characterize this as something that we could aim for within the pilot projects and then see how well that's working in terms of delivering high quality content, technical excellence.
Thank you. Okay, I've got Peter, Kirsten, Evan, you were up and down, right? Peter, and then Kirsten, yeah.
A rationale for why business sector might need to be a significant size in this working group would be that, as I said earlier, it's basically not the same business type of businesses involved in oil and gas versus coal. They are quite different businesses. I think of the only company that comes to mind that actually has operations in both mining, including coal, and in oil and gas is BHP. Maybe other people can name other companies, but by and large, it's quite separate. Core expertise is involved, and the companies tend to specialise. I believe oil and gas companies did actually get heavily involved in coal mining back in the 1980s after the oil price OPEC crisis, but they all lost money, and they all pulled out again after a decade or two because they couldn't actually mine coal. They knew how to do oil and gas, but not coal. So, yeah, an oil and gas company isn't going to be able to provide the expertise on the coal aspects of it, so you will need both types of businesses. That issue actually applied to organised labour as well, but I think that's been changing in recent times as blue-collar unions tend to consolidate, so we should be able to find people who have some expertise in both on the labour side.
When it comes to if the first sector standard for oil and gas and coal should be regarded as a template for the coming ones, I absolutely agree with Madhir that we have to look into it. This is a pilot, and I really hope that we will learn good things there that we can carry through to the other sector standards, but we shouldn't take that as a given before we have started. Thank you.
This could be a question and a comment. How would one deal, for example, with something like an industry association, such as the Minerals Council of South Africa, or who represents a number of business enterprises? I mean, it could be useful to involve someone like that on a working group because they already have access to a broad range of business enterprises? Would they fall into a separate category, or would one consider them as a business enterprise?
I think we have tended to use them, to refer to them as business enterprises.
okay.
Is that not right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's basically who is an organization representing. So it's, we could think of an industry association as an aggregator of businesses. If they're representing businesses, then we would consider them as business enterprise.
Because I think in a, in a sector such as this, and potentially also mining, looking to target some of those might be useful to help get kind of an aggregated perspective right from the start, as well as access then to their broader membership across a number of the industries.
Yes, and if you have particular recommendations for these associations, it's definitely not too late to send me an email or to otherwise indicate here at the meeting or afterwards who might be a useful organization to contact.
I'm back. I mean, to me, I want to go back to your question, which was the sort of general standard or general ideal as we roll out these sectors over time. I think that, we're all of agreement that we want all 5 of these different constituencies represented in all of these working groups. The question is, do we overweight business or some other category based on the particular sector if it has value? But we're not arguing that we would overweight business at the expense of another constituency, correct? No, I assume not.
No, yeah.
No, I think also from a due process perspective, we are required to have all 5. That's a requirement, basically. I think we cannot overlook one of the constituencies, but the question is then whether the report preparers should be disproportionately represented here, and history shows that there's a good case to have them somewhat stronger represented than the others. Yeah.
Okay. We've had some feedback and some recommendations on constituencies. I'd also like to ask about standard setters on the project working group, and whether the GSSB recommends that we reach out proactively to standard setters such as SASB or others to inform them of the open call and to solicit their participation.
Can you say a little bit about what you think might be involved in doing so or not doing so? And would you be talking about holding a space for other standard setters? We've got our 5 stakeholder categories here. I'm not entirely sure they would fall under any of those. Would we hold an additional space? And would that be on a sector-specific basis, or would we be looking to collaborate with them more broadly across the whole of the sector standards pilot project? Just maybe if you can just clarify a little bit more.
These are very good questions, and I'm not sure that I've reached the point of having answers on all of them. I think we had understood standard setters to fall under mediating institutions, but I recognize that our definition isn't precisely geared toward other standard setters. I think in the dialogue that we are hearing within the standards division, which is ever more towards having a greater awareness of other standard setting organizations and harmonizing, that we could see it being potentially very useful to have another standard setter come to a sector project as part of the project working group. These are organizations that, if they have sector projects, have already been through this process and have already looked at these issues, even if it was from another angle, like a financial materiality angle. So I don't have a firm recommendation to make, or I don't want to advise necessarily, but just to hear more your thoughts on whether you think this is useful.
Well, maybe I'll start then. I suppose from my own perspective, it would be useful to hear what other standard setters' experiences have been. I don't know, and I don't have a strong feeling about what the right platform for having those conversations might be, or what role we might extend to those organizations. But I think it is probably only to our advantage to understand the things that they learned in the process of doing what they've done. I think it's in addition to the fact that you flagged that some of them might be coming from a different perspective. You mentioned financial materiality as the potential financial impact as one of the possible nuances. They, in some cases, will have taken different classification decisions as well, which, as we've seen already today, is a bedeviled issue. Anyway, we could go all around the houses about classification. So there are lots of things that could be opened up in that, and I wonder if there isn't a piece of work to just sort of almost to sort of include this in the terms of reference. If it's meant to be on a sector-specific basis, if we're doing terms of reference for each one of these projects, I wonder if there's something to help sort of put into the mix the specific perspectives and roles and experiences of other standard setters, and maybe to help kind of guide that input, so that we don't run the risk of going all around the houses and revisiting things that won't be useful in our discussion.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that under advisement.
Others?
All right.
Well, you've maybe just very quickly. I mean, you've put on the question here, for example, SASB. Do we have other for examples that you want to put into that? I mean, there is IPCA, and you're aware that they're looking at their oil and gas voluntary guidance now. Yes. For release early next year. Are there other? I'm not sure that I would classify them as a standard setter, to be entirely on. I don't think they would call themselves a standard setter either. But beyond SASB, I mean, do you have an idea of specifically which organizations we need to consider here?
I think it will be different over time, depending on what work has been generated. So the World Benchmarking Alliance is just getting started. Later on, it might be useful to have them attend a project working group if they have been in a sector before we are able to get there. I think there are others. It seems to be a changing mix of organizations, potentially CDP for some sectors, or ISO. I'm not certain if ISO has been to your groups before. Does anyone else have input on this?
Maybe just one input from me. I think it is important for us to see that there is also a communication aspect to the involvement of other standard setters. When we set out now with the sector program and start to publicize it, people will say, so here's GRI coming up with another take on sectors, right? And I think we have very good reasons to initiate that project. But at the same time, what we don't probably want to suggest is that we're starting from scratch. We want to build on, where relevant, the work of others. And I think we can do that from a positioning of strengths, to say we also look at inputs from the likes of SASB that have gone through very elaborate processes, granted with a different focus, so that we cannot we're not running the risk that we're going to exposure, and then we find that people say, well, clearly you haven't looked at X, Y, Z. So we will have a look at how we can bring that back, and maybe also have a discussion then with the specific case of SASB, to what extent they could actually come in on this. I mean, they of course have also a very limited capacity to support these kind of projects, but maybe we can discuss avenues by which they can provide input to the project, whether that's a membership. I don't see a very clear signal from the GSB that this is a must, but we can explore that with them with priority.
Kirsten.
I don't think I would classify IPEC as a standard setting organization, but still I do believe it's very important to have them with in a process like this. Like it's very important to have ICMM with us when we are looking into mining and metals standard.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll take that under advisement. So we've discussed a few topics. I don't know if there are other feedback or comments on particulars within the terms of reference that you would like to bring forward. Did anything strike you as strange or unexpected? No?
Can I just ask a question? You talked about the team within the standards division. When you say team, does that mean you, or is there some group that's this team?
I should have kept my team slide in the projection. So there are 4 of us within the sector program, but we are sitting within the standards division and working with the standards division, coordinating on a number of aspects. So my team is Karen Williams, who is sitting over there behind Judy, and also Nora Puro, who will be the project manager for the oil, gas, and coal sector standard, and Margarita Lysenkova, who will be the project manager for the agriculture sector standard. Any further suggestions for amendments or things to consider in terms of reference? Oh, okay. I see we're nearing lunchtime, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly. The Stakeholder Council also provided some feedback on the agriculture sector standard proposal and the textiles and apparel sector standard proposal. This feedback the Standards Division will take under advisement, and we will discuss this in more depth when we bring those proposals back again. In terms of next steps, what's coming? If the oil, gas, and coal sector standard is approved when Tony gets here, then we would have open call beginning on April 4th and running through May 4th. Then we would hope to have an electronic vote also in April to approve the agriculture proposal, because there is no GSSB meeting that month. In June, we hope to have a call for nominations for the Agriculture Project Working Group. And on June 27th at the GSSB meeting, we hope to have the approval of the membership for the Oil, Gas, and Coal Project Working Group and a discussion of some sample sector materials for the Project Working Group members that we should be able to bring at that time. In December, depending on project progress, the Standards Division may propose moving the November GSSB meeting to mid-December, but we'll see when we get there. That's all. Thank you.
Madir, I'm very happy to see the forward planning of all the various pieces of these different proposed projects under the sector program, and it's exactly the sort of thing that I feel we need to provide more visibility of, especially for the board and the stakeholder council and others like that, to be able to enable them to plan their own discussions and activities so that they can play a role more effectively, and we can coordinate our timelines in a way that sort of respects their way of working and also allows us to keep an ambitious timeline flowing. So I thank you very much for doing that, and I hope that what we can do in the next few weeks is sort of pull together as much of these things as we can, not just the sector program, but across the various work streams that we have in mind, so that we can just make it clearer. What will we be asking for, from whom, when, so people can kind of mark their calendars if they need to. I think, unless anybody has any discussion, any further comments or questions, I think we may have come to the end of that section, yeah? Okay, so then we have our lunch. Oh, sorry, Peter, yes.
Just a quick point of clarification. Maybe I'm missing something here. The very last point in the last slide said moving November GSSB meeting to December. I thought, which GSSB meeting are we talking about? Because isn't there a September in-person meeting?
No,
so we're talking about the online meeting.
It'll be a virtual meeting.
Just
it's
the
a
online
virtual meeting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe just to add, I think we will know probably, hopefully by June, whether we want to do that or not, and so you have advance notice of a couple of months to move that meeting. But we need to look at how the project unfolds and how now the first stage, in particular recruiting the project working group, how fast we are in achieving that.
Yeah. And keeping multiple projects and work streams going with a finite staff. Yeah. Okay, so I think I think it's simply a thank you to Madeir for your time today and for all your efforts in leading this work for us. We now have a lunch break, which where's my time? We are half an hour ahead of schedule, which is no bad thing. But that means that we have until 1 o'clock for lunch. Yeah, does that work? Will that work with the host as well? With the okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. We'll convene here in an hour, and hopefully we'll be able to start off with the approval that we've had to defer of the projects that we've been discussing this morning. Thank you.